I'll be quoting today from a book I have not even read. A gentleman posted excerpts from the book on CEM and Friends Forum this morning, so I am hardly in a position to give the book an endorsement or a recommendation. In fact, I find things even in the citations in the booklet that I feel require serious qualification. But, having said that, a few of the ideas posted from this book are some of the most provocative ideas that I have heard in the last 40 years. I think we should consider to what extent they are biblical and to what extent maybe we ought to give serious consideration from the churches in our tradition. The book in question is The Mustard Seed Conspiracy. The author's name is Tom Sine. One quotation is this: "At a time in the history of the church when we need literally every man, woman, and child to follow God's calling into lives of active service toward others, so many of us are squandering our lives away in jobs, professions, and leisure time activities that often have nothing to do with God's kingdom call in our lives. I am deeply saddened at the number of beautiful, lavishly gifted young people I meet who have absolutely no sense of life direction, no sense of calling from God. They seem to be floating like so much flotsam on the sea with no idea of where they are going. There are a few who are motivated to pursue some personal career goals, but there are so many whose lives seem to be directed by pure happenstance." Now, it's awfully easy to think that the problems we see in our church are just our problems, that they're singular to us, maybe because of mistakes we have made in the past or because of things that we have done or what have you. This man's a Presbyterian. And he sees this not only in his church, but in churches all over the country and in his life as he walks and meets people who would say that they are Christian, who seem to be Christian, who believe in God, who believe in Jesus Christ, who believe in the Old Testament, believe in the New Testament, and all those things. But their lives are absolutely without any direction. What he sees happening in his church is the same sort of thing that we see happening in our church. And I don't know, I suppose it's just possible we might be able to learn something from time to time if we shared ideas with people like this, if we thought about the things that they have to say, if we learn from their experiences, if we try to apply those things that do work with the Bible to our own situation. Who knows what kind of a difference it might make. Now, in his book, he points to a lot of organizations or people out there who are finding a greater community in their Christian service. And these people are going all the way, in some cases, back to communal living. They're having all things common. They're sharing dwelling spaces together. They are living very much like a Christian family. Personally, I think as I read through his analysis of that and why they do it, I think they're making a mistake. I think that I need to live in my subdivision. I think you need to live in your apartment complex. I think we need to be out there in the world, in touch with the world. Their idea is that the people who do this is not necessarily Sine's idea. Their idea is that by pulling ourselves together, we can we can be able to apply our resources more effectively to ministry. We can lead simpler lives. We don't have to be spending as much time on the job earning a living. We can take care of one another this way, and therefore we have more time for active ministry. So their motives are great. It's just a matter of, philosophically, I think that they are heading off in a little bit of a wrong direction. Anyway, continuing with what he says here. The primary expression of Christian vocation in many churches is what I call surrogate servanthood. The clergy is hired to live out Christian vocation for everyone else. The laity may be involved in occasional volunteer activities and sporadic philanthropy, but the business of being Christian servants and really getting involved in the ministry of Jesus in the world, well, that's what the professional clergy is hired for. Now, I want to give you folks here in this congregation a pat on the back, because we have definitely made progress beyond that. I mean, we are unusual in the churches in our tradition, and we have 3 elders in this church, and a church of this size is really remarkable. But no one in this church seems to think that it is our job, the elders, to do all the visiting of people who are sick and doing all that kind of thing. When I go to the hospital to visit someone sick, I'm just as apt to run into one of you folks in there as to anybody else. And the reason why we all go there is because the person who is sick is our brother, and we love them, and we care about them, and we want to look after them, as Christians really ought to do. So I really am pleased with what we have been able to do in certain areas with this church. I think there are other areas we got a long way to go, but we have made progress in the idea that you don't hire your minister to go out and be a Christian for you, and in particular, not just be a Christian, but to carry out Christian ministry for you. That you understand that it's your job as much as it is any elder in the church's job. In fact, in some ways, maybe even more, because each of us have our own calling to pursue. The apostles, whenever the problem began to arise in Acts, the 6th chapter, got everybody together, and they said, look, it doesn't make a bit of sense for us to leave the ministry of the Word to wait on tables. I want you to find among you 7 men full of the Holy Spirit and wisdom, whom we may appoint over this business, so that we can get on with what we're supposed to do, and they can do this. But even there was no assumption, surely, that it was not everyone's job to look after the sick, the widows, the fatherless, and so forth, who were in God's congregation. It was just merely a matter we've got to realize that each of us has our own gift and our own calling that we have to pursue. Sign continues to say, in this dualistic approach, in other words, we're lay members, you're clergy, we hire a clergyman, he goes out and does ministry on behalf of the church. That way, our job becomes important because we're earning more money, and our money goes to support the ministry, and the ministry gets out there and touches the world, and so forth and so on. And the result of that is, frankly, churches that don't get very much done, because generally speaking, there aren't that many people who really are in the position of being ministers, and even though you're paying his salary, even though he's working at it full time, no one man can accomplish what a whole church can accomplish working together if everybody's working. In this dualistic approach, careers for the laity are seen almost exclusively as secular activities that have little to do with the Christian vocation practiced by the clergy. The focus and vocation for many laypersons seems to have much more to do with the secular agenda of getting ahead and building security than with the biblical agenda of living their faith. And I'm afraid we would all have to, don't move, but internally you've got to nod your head and know that that's the truth. That we have to be, we think, well, I have to be. And there's one thing that this fellow, I think, seems to overlook, he may not overlook, because I haven't read the book, I have only read the excerpt from it. But the excerpts seem to focus on people like Matthew, who walked away from his business to follow Christ. Peter and those who were fishermen and walked away from their businesses to follow Christ. And Luke, who was a physician but apparently left his practice to follow Paul and Christ, incidentally, in the process. Focus on these people. But, of course, every one of these people has one interesting thing in common. Every one of them was at that time single. They had no family to support, no children to take care of. They were single. They did not have those obligations. But, having said that, I still want to return to what the man says. That there is an idea on many of our parts that our secular vocation, the way we earn our living over here, well, that's a compartment of our life, and our church over here is another compartment of our life, and we give portions of this to it. His argument is, in fact, it's really interesting in reading some aspects of what he says, is that there are some Christian people who really ought to consider a change in job and career, because their job and their career is not compatible with a Christian way of life. You start getting scary there when you talk about that, don't you? And it would be very scary if you were somebody who was in a power over you was talking to you like that. But someone who is just telling you, hey, check the Bible, and check inside yourself, check in prayer with God, and ask yourself some serious questions. Is what you are doing what God wants you to be doing? Is it compatible with being a Christian? He uses some examples that I thought were not very well thought out about things that you might do in the defense establishment and what have you. But at the same time, I really think we have to consider that we may be working for a company that's cheating the public. We may be working for somebody that's, that is in their publications about our product is lying about it, in their advertising. We really have to think about that kind of thing. And he says that, you really, as a Christian, if you're going to really walk the walk and talk the talk, not just talk the talk, you've got to think about some of these things. And I think his point is very well taken. But it's up to each person to take that to his prayer closet, talk to God about it, and figure out what it does mean to follow a biblical agenda of actually living your faith in every part of your life, so that even what you are doing on the job is not just, well, I earn my living over here and I drop a little word for Jesus once in a while. That we actually live our faith even on the job. In some Christian churches, this dualism is expressed in a different way. While the laity's primary involvement is in their secular careers, they often invest large amounts of their discretionary time in committees, programs, and activities of their church. Now, we're a very small church, and this kind of thing wouldn't get us real bad. But if you go to one of the really big churches around this town, If you were to, let's say, if we were to become one of the really big churches around this town, it's not hard to see how easy it would be for the church in its activities to eat up every bit of discretionary time you have got in committee meetings and ministries and working out your details, building your buildings, doing your things over here, to eat up everything you have and leave you nothing left to go out to the community, to the people, to your neighbors, to touch lives, to change the people you work with, and to carry the ministry of Jesus Christ to them. Wouldn't it be easy? It'd be just like falling off a log to do that. It would be, in fact, the normal thing to do. Because a church, it's very easy for a church, and especially in the modern world, to become a social club. And it becomes the place we go, and these are our friends, and these are our church people, and other people, well, they're not our church people. And I certainly believe, I'm one of those who believe that our church people are special. Paul says that we are supposed to remember to do good to all men, but especially to the household of faith. And I don't have any disagreement, which God forbid, with anything Paul would say. I'm going to have to talk with him one of these days, and he'll probably call me on some of that. But the way he finishes this thought, he says they spend all this discretionary time in committees and programs and activities of their churches. Unfortunately, little of this time and energy is focused on the urgent spiritual, emotional, and physical needs of those outside the church. And I think you would find, if you were to, go be an investigative reporter and start making your way through the churches of your town, you would find that pattern being repeated. You will find exceptions. You will find also churches where that pattern exists, but because they know they must, they still have some individuals in these churches who are going out and touching the community around them and establishing little missions and doing things in the community and so forth. So they do know that obligation is there, and yet the church can still absorb so much of your life. Now there's a fallacy that is inherent in our idea of church, and I hope I can come back to it later and underline it for you, because it really is connected very much to this little problem I'm right here talking about allowing the church to eat you up, the service of the church. Because who can criticize the service for the church? Who can criticize taking care of your brethren? Who can criticize fellowship with your brethren? Who can criticize being there for your brethren? Who can criticize getting together to plan how to serve the community better? No one can criticize that. But there is buried in this a fallacy, which I will come back to. I will also tell you, I think, why I think some of the problems we have exist. This also indirectly underlines what I think is a major problem that we have and a major error that a lot of churches have. The major error is the assumption that evangelism is purely message. For us, it translates out to evangelism is mostly doctrine, doesn't it? Evangelism is to go out to the world and tell them, no, the Sabbath was not abolished. The Sabbath was not done away with. Sunday is of pagan origin. We go to church on the Sabbath. You should rest on the Sabbath day. And we preach the Sabbath day. We preach that Sunday is wrong. And the whole idea then is the doctrine is the evangelism is to save people from Sunday observance. Evangelism is telling people that Christmas is pagan. Evangelism is telling people that you do not have an immortal soul. Evangelism is, shall I go on and list off all the old booklets from all of our deals? Now, there's nothing wrong with those ideas. Those are truths. And our doctrines are right, or we wouldn't hold them as doctrines, right? But we confuse, I think, evangelism with doctrine. And we assume that evangelism is purely doctrinal. I will tell you why so many of our people, or people who have been in our churches, are off chasing doctrinal rabbits all over the countryside. And they are, aren't they? Anybody want to argue with me that we don't have people chasing all kinds of doctrines, and new doctrines are coming up, and churches are splitting over doctrines, and new churches are rising all over the place? How many people, how many different times this year will the Feast of Tabernacles be observed in different places, at different locations? How many different, times of the year will there be for Passover observance this year? We all know this, don't we? We know that people are scattered like a bunch of rabbits all over the, it's almost been like somebody threw a big bird dog right in the middle of a covey of quail and sent them all over the landscape. They're gone. They're out there. Why is this kind of happening? I think it is because they're looking for meaning in their lives and in their religious experience. Whether they know it or not, they are looking for a Christian vocation. They are looking for some way of having special meaning in their lives, a special relationship with God, or there is something down inside of every single one of us that we really want to believe that we are special, our lives have meaning, that we're going some ways, we've got something, and we've got something that really has meaning involved in it. And because in the past our church has not encouraged, and has positively discouraged, and sometimes not allowed people to find that meaning in a Christian vocation, they have tried to find it in doctrine. Now, I want you to take that home and think about that for a while. That people have not been allowed to go to God, to pray, to ask God to show them what He wants in their lives, to show them what their walk with Him is supposed to be like, to show Him how their little old life can impact the world around them, how they can help someone else live their lives, how they can save someone from the wretchedness of this world, how they personally can make a difference in the world. That to allow them, encourage them, and persuade them to actually do that in their lives is a part of the role of the church. And when people are blocked from service in those areas, they're going to look for that kind of meaning someplace else. And because our tradition and our training and our culture has developed around the idea that doctrine is everything, well, then it is inevitable that as people begin to pursue this, we're going to have this. The church was built on doctrine. So the only way to try to find true validation is the perpetual refinement of doctrine. And in doctrine, we find the potential for endless division. It's a funny thing about this, that what takes place in some ways in the church is a half-baked version of what took place in Judaism in the period of time subsequent to the construction of the Second Temple and through that period of time. As everything became focused on the study of and the refinement of our understanding of the Torah, the Mishnah was developed during that period of time, and it involved endless reading, not only of the Scriptures, but endless reading and study of everything that every rabbi had ever said about the Torah and the interlacing of all these things. It was, in our terminology, an endless discussion of the refinement of doctrine. And of course, Judaism divided nearly as many ways, not quite as many ways, but nearly as many ways as Christianity has divided. Until about 50 years ago, we really didn't have any idea how divided first century Judaism was. It's only been with the development of the Dead Sea Scrolls that we have begun to understand how deeply and profoundly divided that community was over doctrine, Torah studies, and the endless discussion of these things. I've had an interesting illustration in my own situation. I had a phone call from a very good friend inquiring about, my doctrinal beliefs relative to the holy days. There has been, it's been going around now for probably 3 years. It kind of cycles back in and out from time to time. The people say that Ron Dart doesn't believe in the holy days. It goes back to a statement that I made at a Friends of the Sabbath meeting in San Antonio about, was it 3 years ago that particular meeting took place? In which I was discussing the typology of the holy days. And I concluded that I did not actually believe that the Feast of Tabernacles pictured the millennium. All this comes from that. And the rumor has been making the rounds that I don't believe in keeping the holy days. Well, my friend who called me, he'd said he'd come by him, and he wanted to he said the best thing to do is go to the horse's mouth. And I said, sure. And I told him categorically, no, I believe in keeping the holy days. I believe the holy days are just as much a part of God's plan as the Sabbath day is. I believe that we are required to do so. It's a matter of obedience to God and so forth. And, what was said was that you don't believe that they pictured the plan of salvation. Now, what that means is, and so you will understand, and some of you have not been around long enough to know what this involves. The Worldwide Church of God for many years taught correctly that we should observe the holy days, that the holy days picture the plan of salvation. I believe that then, I believed it now, I believe it now. They picture the plan of salvation. But the Worldwide Church of God had a typology, a symbolism set up for the holy days that was all nice and neat and laid out and basically required. You know how things are in an organization like that. There's a doctrinal orthodoxy, and you must not depart from it. All of the meaning of each one of these days was all settled, put in a box, ribbon was put on it, it was put on the shelf, and it was supposed to be left alone. Well, once I resigned from the organization and was not under that obligation any longer and felt free to examine the meaning of the holy days, I found that they still picture the plan of salvation, but that there are nuances, there are depths, there are areas that we had never explored, there are meanings and depths that we had not plumbed, and so consequently for about 20 years I have been developing those ideas out of holy day typology from the Bible, and they do vary somewhat from what other people would think. Now, the question now involves, though, that for true validation, you must be doctrinally orthodox. You must, believe this precisely as we do. Now, people don't think about this. It's a habitual response. There's not a mean-spirited response. It's not an ugly thing. It's not an insincere response. It's a habitual response. You are used to seeing everything exactly the same way. And when someone tries to make you see it from a slightly different perspective, it is a little bit threatening. It is that way because doctrinal refinement, the endless pursuit of the perfection of doctrine, creates an atmosphere in which someone who says, goodness, did you ever think that maybe the Feast of Tabernacles does not picture the millennium, but something else? That such a person is a threat. It's natural that type of thing should happen in one way. It's natural given the fact that a church is married to the idea of the refinement of doctrine. Now, again, I'm not criticizing the people who feel that way, but what I am doing is pointing out that the time is coming for them and for everybody else that we need to understand that we do not define ourselves before God that way. And that's where I think a lot of problems have come. I think there was, back in the beginnings of our tradition of the church, I think Herbert W. Armstrong found a basic core of doctrine for the church, and he found it in a proactive way. In other words, he came across some ideas, he was challenged on his own thoughts on these ideas, and he went down to the library and he set himself to find out what's the truth in this matter. At the end of his search, he found that the Sabbath day should be observed. And in the months and the years that followed, Herbert Armstrong pursued a course of trying to find truth. Now, somewhere along the way, and my history in the church is not strong enough to tell you precisely where it was. I think it was probably after about 1948 and the establishment of Ambassador College. At some point in there, the ideas of what I have come to call a radical anti-paganism began to define the doctrines of the church. In other words, there are books like The Golden Bough, books like Hislop's Two Babylons, that go back, and they're very anti-Catholic, these booklets, and they're going back there establishing the pagan origins of many of the doctrines and the practices of the Catholic Church, which is all well and good. But by the time I got to college in 1958, the radical anti-paganism was in full bloom. And there was discussion about things all the way from whether or not it was wrong to wear a wedding ring, which kind of ebbed and flowed, and finally everybody decided it was all right. I mean, to the people, to individuals, immature college students who were disturbed by the fact that in a pool of water out here, two sidewalks crossed it at right angles. Do you know why? Because the cross is pagan. And that to even have two sidewalks crossing at right angles was troublesome to this immature person. The problem was, we made some progress in those days with people, but the reason why we got into that situation and the reason why we weren't able to help people along is because the whole church had kind of gotten into a reactive mode. In other words, we defined ourselves more by what we were not than by what we are. That's what I mean by reactive. And defining yourself by what you are is proactive, okay? All right, here I am, I'm a student at Ambassador College, and I'm attending ambassador clubs. Everybody knows that I used to be a Baptist. Here we sit in the club meeting one evening, and this is the first evening for probably a month after college started. No alcoholic beverages were allowed on campus. That was so the Baptists who were there wouldn't get offended and go home. Well, after about a little while into it, a sermon was given, usually, or a Bible study on a Friday night, on worldliness, at which time it was explained to us that alcoholic beverages were not worldly, that dancing was not necessarily worldly, and these weren't necessarily sins, and that was to inoculate all the fundamentalist Protestants that it was okay to go to college dances, okay to have a glass of wine once in a while. You understand. And so I attend a club one evening after this has been done, and this is their first night to have beer at the club. Big deal, beer. You know how college students are about beer. This is not a peculiarity of Ambassador College. In fact, we're better than most of them on that one we were. Beer at colleges is, never mind. Anyway, it was the first time we had beer at a club. Everybody had a glass of beer, that's all, just one glass. And I just let mine sit there. Oh, no, I'm sorry. I told them not to give me any beer. I said, no, I don't drink. Well, the club president was very disturbed. He said, he was just concerned. He said, well, Ron, he said, is it because you have something against it? And I told him, no, I don't have anything against it. I just don't like beer. Believe it or not, I didn't like it. And, what can I tell you? When I was about this high, I insisted. My dad let me have a drink of his beer one day, and I thought it was the worst thing I'd ever tasted in my life. I mean, I thought Dr. Pepper was good. I loved Great Pet. Beer? Give me a break. But, in the course of time, I really did learn to like beer, and I appreciate it to this day. But what was fascinating to me was that in the process of time, it became very obvious that a lot of things were done, including drinking, more to prove that we were not Protestant than anything else. And I really think that drinking became it almost became a mantra of sorts among people. They were very disturbed by a student that didn't drink. Do you realize something? That's characteristic of alcoholics. They are disturbed by people who don't drink with them. And I've noticed that in the past when I've been with an alcoholic who I didn't have a drink. He said, well, sure you don't want something? And was, just really upset and disturbed by the fact that I and a friend of mine were having iced tea at lunch instead of having a beer at lunch. Now, a lot of this stuff happened because I really think that in our church tradition we had at least our share of alcoholics along with the rest of the world, and a lot of it happened because people were trying to prove that they were not Protestant. Now, this, I think, has become quite a problem to us. But evangelism became doctrine, and it has been a real revelation to me doing my radio program out of the Gospels. I have now done a full set of Matthew all the way through, verse by verse. And I'm now 43 programs into a different series entitled The Words of Jesus, in which I'm using the harmony of the Gospels, going through all 4 Gospels simultaneously, looking for the red letter sections to talk about what Jesus really said, as opposed to what people say that he said. And as I've made my way through all that, talking about the words and the acts of Jesus to the public, I am really struck at how rare it is for me to come across a program where I'm going to explain something that is going to be really shocking to a Baptist or a Presbyterian or a Methodist. What it is underlined in my mind is most of what we believe is the same. I had a really lovely letter from a Baptist lady in Houston who had been listening to the program on her way to work, on her way to church on Sunday morning. Loved the program, wrote a $400 check. This to a program, and I don't know how long she had been listening, but I didn't get the impression it couldn't have been all that long because we hadn't been on KKHD all that long. Now, what strikes me about this is that people can listen to me for a long time preaching the truth out of the Bible, out of the words of Jesus Christ, and not know how different I am from them. The reason is because I am proactive on the program. I am not reactive. I do not hesitate when I come to a reference that talks about the soul being mortal to explain that we do not have an immortal soul. When we die, we're dead. And if God doesn't raise us, we're going to stay dead. I have no problem saying that, but I don't go to that until I come to it in the Bible. And what has really been surprising to me, I know the Bible real well, and I thought as I went through the Bible that I would be coming into this about every week. Just somewhere on there, I'd run into it all the time. What has shocked the daylights out of me is how rare it is in going verse by verse through the Bible that I run into a problem. Fall on the air yet. I'm going to. But when I do that, I will run into considerably more. In fact, we'll probably have a lot of fun when I get into the Epistles of Paul, which is the next series. What I'm going to do on the radio program for your information is when I have finished, God willing, when I finish the Words of Jesus series I'm on now, I plan to go into a second series called Christian Origins, which is going to be essentially what is in the Epistles of Paul series that a lot of you people have already listened to. You go verse by verse through the book of Acts until you come to where a letter was written, and go off to the letter of Paul, go through the letter of Paul, and discuss the whole thing in relation to the book of Acts, what was going on in the church, what Paul really taught, what Paul's background was, and all the things that go with it. A lot of you have gone through those series, and you know what I talk about. What is interesting to me about it is, somebody thought that I should take that series and just cut it up and put it on a broadcast. And I have never seriously considered that for any reason, but now, after the experience that I've got of doing about 184 programs now, I know that I must not. The reason being is that when I did that series before in the radio studio, I was thinking about you. I was not thinking about the people out there driving around in their cars. And the programs now, as I go through the Gospels and all this type of thing, are different in important ways. They're subtle, some of them, but they're different in important ways from what I would do in a Bible study for the church. I did the Epistles of Paul series basically because I wanted to get my thoughts on that somewhere, on tape for whatever period of time people would want them, so that I myself wouldn't forget, the things that I had learned in all the years I had taught the Epistles of Paul. I used my old notes and tried to get all that stuff down. I will probably refer to those a lot in the course of doing radio programs on it. But the thing is that I think that we have focused so much on doctrine, and particularly doctrinal distinctives, that we have lost track of what evangelism is. All right? Here's your quiz. What is evangelism? Write me out a paragraph. Again, if this were an exam, I'd say write me out a paragraph that explains what evangelism is from a New Testament point of view. And I think you will be surprised if you take a little time and try to think it through. Maybe spend some time going back and actually reading the messages and the sermons of the evangelists who were out there doing the work in the New Testament, and understand that it was taking the fact, the resurrection of Jesus Christ to the world. But don't forget, in your analysis of it, to look at those things that Jesus told us that we were supposed to be doing with people in the world. It included healing the sick, and feeding the hungry, and giving clothing to people that were naked, and visiting people in prison, and all these things that have to do with engaging the world around us for their good. Jesus' message was a message of salvation. Salvation, folks, is a rescue operation for people whose lives are being destroyed. That's what it's all about. Evangelism involves engaging the world with the whole message of Jesus Christ, most of which is not doctrinal. It isn't doctrinal in the sense of the little fine distinctives that manage to divide us, scatter us like a bunch of rabbits across the landscape. That's not what we are supposed to be doing with the gospel of Jesus Christ. Going on with what he had to say, one aspect of the dualistic attitude toward Christian vocation is a remarkably non-critical view of secular employment. Any job is being viewed as good as any other job for Christians as long as they work hard, are honest, and say a little word for Jesus when the opportunity arises. Then he says this: all human activity should be done to the glory of God. Well, that's easy, isn't it? That doesn't challenge you very much, does it? All human activity. Was he right or is he wrong? Seems to me that I read in the New Testament where it says, do all things to the glory of God. So I'm afraid that he has given us here something that is very important. So that when you go to work Monday morning, you should be there to do all things to the glory of God. He lays out here one of the most disturbing challenges I've seen anybody lay out in a long time. The realization that you even need to take a good hard look at your job in relation to whether or not you are able to work toward the glory of God. Now, I don't know what he would say about a guy who's got 5 kids and a mortgage and is working someplace he ought not to work. I'm not one to tell a guy he ought to jump up and quit that job. What I do think a man ought to do, though, is take that to God on his knees and give it a lot of hard prayer and a lot of thought, because the man is right. We are to do everything we do to the glory of God. He continues to say, but the problem with this doctrine of Christian calling is that not all human activity is synonymous with the biblical concept of vocation, nor does it promote God's agenda. There are life decisions, jobs, personal goals that are at best irrelevant and at worst diametrically opposed to God's intervention in history. It's true. In Jesus Christ, every believer, lay and clergy alike, has a vocation that should be reflected in every dimension of his or her existence. Yeah? Every one of us has a vocation. Now, one of the problems that we have had in the past is that we think our calling is our initial calling into the church. And having been called and having come into the church, that's taken care of, and that's all done with. We don't have to think about that anymore. Wrong. Wrong. As I'll tell you in a moment, or show you in a few moments, every one of us has not only that calling, but every one of us has a purpose in God's plan. Every one of us has a place in His scheme. Every one of us has a curious vocation, as it were, a calling that is ours and that is no one else's. And most of us have not given that a minute's thought. Just have not given it any thought. And have not really asked ourselves, how does this apply to my job? How does this apply to my career? What's it going to do to my family? How is it going to help me live out God's intentions in the world and in my life? You know, how's it going to do that? What is my calling? What is it that I am supposed to do? In Jesus Christ, every believer, lay and clergy alike. Remember, we're being told this by a Presbyterian. He's right. Have a vocation that should be reflected in every dimension of his or her existence, as it was in the lives of the first disciples. Every Christian has a ministry calling. I agree with him. Every Christian has a ministry calling. And yes, that may mean some will feel challenged to change jobs, cut back working hours, or begin to challenge unethical practices where they work. Think about that one for a minute. But above all else, it should mean that every area of the life of a believer centers around God's kingdom call. I don't know of any way to argue with that. I really don't. Now, I said we were going to talk about this from a biblical point of view, so grab your Bible and let's turn to Romans, the 12th chapter, as a place to start thinking about this and how it might apply in our lives. Romans chapter 12. Most of us who preach, our Bibles are worn out in certain places, and Romans 12 tends to be one of them. We probably go to this and a few other places in the Bible more often than any other, because this one is so relevant to the way we live our life. I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service. This is not an unreasonable request. Your body, a living sacrifice, holy, that means set apart, acceptable to God, and be not conformed to this world. Be you transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. Will of God about what? Folks, what? His will of God, His will about your church. His will about your home, or your family, or your kids, or your car, or your job. Or is it maybe about everything? That you may prove what is that good and perfect and acceptable will of God, period. That's what we're supposed to be doing. And we are called upon not to be conformed to the world. That is probably the greatest challenge that anybody could ever make to us, because what it really is telling us is that in our daily life, including our work and our jobs and everywhere else, we really should not be just like everybody else. People should really wonder about us. People should respect us. They should perhaps be disturbed by us. Not that we're bad people, not that we're unkind to people, but perhaps that we are too kind. Perhaps that we are too ethical. Perhaps that we are too moral. Perhaps that we say, I'm sorry, boss, I can't stand still for that. I will not do that for you. I will not publish that ad. I will not design that ad. I will not print that ad, because it's simply not true. That kind of people standing up will lose jobs, yeah. But somewhere along the line, people in the past, when they stood up for what was right, lost their heads, not their jobs. And I really wonder sometimes, is it easier to lose your head or is it easier to lose your job? I think we may face the decision of losing our head easier than losing our job. After you lose your head, it's over. Lose your job, you still got to struggle on through. I don't know what the dynamics of it are, but I have to think about this about myself as well, just like I have to think about you. Where are we going to draw the lines in our lives? What are we going to suffer for? What are we going to get hurt for? What are we going to lose our little finger for, much less our head? What are we going to give up our car for? What are we going to give up our job for? These are questions that a Christian who's really looking for God in his life will face once in a while. And I just think sometimes we don't think enough about that. I say, through the grace of God given unto me, to every man who is among you, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think soberly, according as God has dealt to every man and woman the measure of faith. We got many members in here, but we're one body, and all the members don't have the same office. And the idea of office here is not a room over here that we sit in. The word actually basically is talking about your calling. All members do not have the same calling. Now, we've all got the same calling into the church. So that's not what he's talking about, right? He's not talking about that. We all have a different calling once we're in. What's yours? I got a fair idea of what mine is, and probably there are areas that I haven't really given enough attention to, but at the same time, what's yours? As we do not have the same office. We, being many, are one body in Christ. We are everyone members one of another. We have then gifts differing according to the grace that is in us. Whether prophecy, let's prophesy according to the proportion of faith. If it's service, let's wait on our service. If he that teaches, let him wait on his teaching. Or he that exhorts, on exhortation. He that gives, let him do it with simplicity. He that rules, with diligence. He that shows mercy, with cheerfulness. Let love be without pretense. Hate that which is evil. Cleave to that which is good. Be kindly affectioned to one another with brotherly love, in honor preferring one another. Now, there's another thing that comes out of this, and he will develop it later in his comments in this particular thing. None of this makes any sense, or makes very much sense, if you're out there all by yourself, does it? We're all members. We're supposed to be part of a body. We're supposed to be functioning together. Putting it another way, and his words are community. That we are supposed to be a part of a community. He's dead right. Okay, fine. There are times when you are on your own. The Ethiopian eunuch was on your own. And when circumstances force you to be on your own, hey, struggle with it. Do what you can with it. But realize that the assumption and the presumption throughout the New Testament is you are a part of a Christian community. And the Christian community is supposed to help us. One thing, he says something rather interesting in here. I don't know, haven't really. Well, actually, yes, it's right here. Once God's sense of kingdom call begins to crystallize in your life, it is essential that it be submitted to a group of brothers and sisters for confirmation. The whole idea is that a lot of us get a lot of wild ideas from time to time. And we really need to ask other brothers and sisters about it so that we have somebody to tell us, you know, I don't know. I don't think what you're thinking is right. I don't think it's biblical. I don't see that God would be leading you to do that. Somebody needs to question it. Somebody needs to help us to question it. We need a church. We need brothers. We need sisters. We need people that whenever we think we feel the call of God in our lives to go out and take a chance and do something, that we can have confirmation of that from our brothers and our sisters. I think that he is right, and that's important. And he right here cites Acts 13, verses 1 through 3, which is when the church in Antioch, there were certain prophets and teachers in the church up there, and as they were studying and praying, the Holy Spirit said, separate me, set apart Paul and Barnabas for the work to which I have called them. And when the church at Antioch, had prayed and fasted, they laid hands on them, the church did, and commissioned them to the job. The laying on of hands is an act of separation. And that's what they did. It said, separate me, Paul and Barnabas, for this work. And the church at Antioch sent those people out at the direction of the Holy Spirit. The work was done by two men. But those two men were commissioned and sent on their way and launched by a local church community that fasted and that prayed and that saw clearly that this was God's will. I don't know how they did it. I don't know how that all came about. But I'll tell you one thing. It was there. This was not something that Paul and Barnabas were sitting around drinking beer one day and said, hey, why don't we take an evangelistic journey somewhere? They would have needed, and they knew they needed, not only the financial support, needed some money to make that trip, but they wanted to know that every day they were gone, that there would be a church behind them, praying for them, supporting them, in their hearts and in their minds, and going with them every step of the way, even though they were at home and these men were out on the road. He says that one of the most astonishing features of this incendiary fellowship up there in Antioch was their sense of corporate guidance. Now, this I think is very important. Their call came when a number of people had been together over an extended period of time. It included the use of the disciplines of fasting and prayer and worship. And I think that the gentleman says we would be well advised to encourage groups of people who are willing to fast and pray and worship together until they have discerned the mind of the Lord and His will and His call. I've said that before, that I really feel that there's a temptation on our part to think that this is our church and we're going to do this and we're going to make wise decisions and we're going to think this thing through and we're going to decide this or we're going to go this way. I know that we have thought this way. But he makes the point, and it's one that we must never forget, that day in and day out, we must go to God as a church for these things. One of the things that's missing among us is the idea of group prayer. It's missing among us because I think in many ways we are, again, reactive people, and we've reacted against the idea. And many people in our tradition would be very uncomfortable with the idea of group prayer. And yet you don't have to go very far in the Bible, back around Acts 12, to find Peter and the others in jail, and the church is gathered together to pray for these men. They're not in their own separate homes praying for these men. They are together praying for these men. What I would like to recommend to all of you who hear this tape later or hear my voice, what have you, is that at some future time, you set aside a Bible study period of time for your church where it's assigned ahead of time that you're going to come together and you're going to talk about group prayer. And you're going to talk about whether or not praying together should be an important part of your church or not. And if it is going to be an important part of your church, how are you going to go about doing it? Where are we going to go from here? Because there's one thing that is absolutely clear. The Bible does recognize the importance of praying together. It may make us uncomfortable, and because it makes us uncomfortable, some of us uncomfortable, I don't think we should launch into it until we have gotten together and talked about it and come to a resolution in our own minds about what God's will is for this congregation, and for you out there who hear this later, what God's will is for your congregation. Nobody is going to be on high imposing this and handing it down to you. But I will tell you, there must be in God's economy a reason for praying together, because it is very much a part of what we find in the book. Public prayer. We know that we're not to be praying to be seen of men. We know we're not supposed to be posturing in prayer. But does that mean we will never pray together? No, it doesn't. We know that because we pray twice up here every time during church. Somebody leads us and we all say amen at the end of it. So we're that far along the road already, right? We need to talk. We need to analyze this. Now, there are, and I'm not going to have time left to turn to scriptures and do very much. I mean, I was going to turn to Ephesians 4 and take a little time going through Ephesians 4 and the way in which Paul talks about us serving one another and serving the church. It's interesting as you read your way through the epistles, you find a great deal about ministering to one another. A great deal of what is there has to do with taking care of the church, taking care of the church, taking care of the church. And there's a temptation in that, and it does tend to lead, in fact, to the fact that we wind up taking care of ourselves. There's an assumption in it, I think, that is faulty. And the assumption is this. I mentioned earlier I was going to talk about this. We tend to think, and I don't think we're the only ones that do this, we tend to think of the church as a private institution. In the New Testament, the church was a public institution. Remember in 1 Corinthians 14 where Paul is taking them to task for the way in which they conduct Sabbath services and people speaking in tongues and jumping up all over the place and anybody speaking wherever he felt like it? He said, you keep on doing this. He said, what is the unbeliever and the unlearned going to think when he walks into your service? He's going to think you're all crazy as a bunch of bedbugs. But if you're carrying on decently and in order and preaching the truth, they're going to say, God is here. God is in this place. Well, I want to tell you something. The church should be a public institution. We should have people visiting with us on the outside. I was reading a book recently that said something very interesting, that over half of the churches in this country are less than 75 members in regular attendance. Less than 75. You don't have to be big. And in fact, what that tends to say is, in many ways, is that in some ways the small churches are more effective. But secondly, the next thing it said is that this is statistically a fact. This isn't guesswork. That by far and away, by a margin like that, the reason why people come to churches is because they are invited by family or friends or coworkers or neighbors. And all you've got to do is take a moment and think about this. You see an advertisement in the paper that a local church of whatever it is down here is having a special meeting on this weekend, and they're going to talk about a subject, and it just happens that you are interested in that topic. Imagine yourself walking down to this place and walking up to it and looking around, and maybe it's in a motel somewhere. And you say, well, I guess I'll go on in. And you go in, and here's a group of people milling around, and all of them seem to know one another. And you walk in, and nobody knows you. Do you feel comfortable? No way you're going to feel comfortable. It depends on how strong a soul you are. It depends on what kind of a glad-hander you are, whether you will even go in or whether you'll turn around and go home. But if you have been invited there by somebody you know and like and trust, and you walk in together, and the person you are with can introduce you to some people, you feel comfortable right away. And that's why the biggest single reason why churches grow in this country is because people invite friends, family, and neighbors to come to church with them. And when they get there, they are blessed. That's why it works. And so when you read in here about ministering to the church and taking care of one another, he is talking about a church that has all kinds of different people there, in which the public is welcome, in which friends and family are invited, in which people who are desperately in need of encouragement and help are present. The church is a powerful tool for ministry in a community. And frankly, it's one of the reasons, I think, why it's so important that churches be free to pursue the ministry in their own community as God leads that local church, because nobody several states away or 1,000 miles away, or as far as that's concerned across town, is going to know how this church ought to minister in this community and how we can be effective. And one of the great problems that we have of the corporate churches who are doing their best and trying to do their best is they cannot do anything much. Almost anything they do interferes with a local church carrying on ministry in their community, which requires anyone who is running that kind of a church to be incredibly sensitive to not interfere in the way in which a local church consults God and responds to the Spirit of God and begins to work and to move in their community. I can't say this strong enough. There are a lot of people who believe that the idea of a centralized corporate church is absolutely wrong and cannot work under any circumstances, and they may be right. They may be. But I'm going to say I don't think it has to be that way. My experience is so far it has been that way, but I don't think it has to be if you have a leadership that is enlightened enough not to govern. That's what the bottom line is. Jesus Christ is the head of each and every part of his church. And all of us need to be able, singly, individually, and together, because together we can keep ourselves from doing stupid things, to consult God, to look for his leadership, and to follow that leadership in our own church, in our own community, and the work we've got to do. In conclusion, I would like to go back to the guy's original thought, and that is how easy it is to lose the direction in your life and to not know what your life is all about, and to have a lot of beautiful, intelligent, talented young people whose lives are being absolutely wasted because they don't have a clue what God wants for them. This is the thing that every single person needs to address. What does God want for me? Not just from me. What does he want for me? Where does he want my life to go? Because I will tell you If you're listening to my voice right now, you're hearing what I'm having to say. God has you in His mind. And He has in mind something that He wants for you. Your task is to find it.